is forcing you to sit.
Welcome back, everyone, to the official
everybody.
scientific,
This is
indisputable.
Hello, everybody. This is Professor Bopper here for a quick video where I'm going to be reacting to the fan rankings that we did about 6 months ago. I meant to do this a lot sooner, but I just didn't really have the time for. So when we did those videos, I reviewed 5 of the 22 games in the series. So I didn't get to give my full thoughts on really any of the games. I mostly covered the spin-off games, Warriors, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, BS Fire Emblem. So I didn't really talk a whole lot about the main series games. And since I have done this video, I've gone back, I've played a couple of more of the games, refresh myself on the stories of them. So I think I can give a better rankings. This is my personal tier list, personal rankings of the game, and I'll give my thoughts on the fan ranking. So my personal challenge for this video is that I get it all done in the time it takes me to listen to Crimson by Alkaline Trio. It is a 42-minute, 54-second album, according to Spotify. So that's how much time we've got. Now, I want to preface this right from the front by saying that, or give the big asterisk, that lists and rankings they're kind of silly. You know, they can change over time. They can change day to day. You know, I could look back on this list tomorrow and be like, oh, you know, I don't think I made a good case for this game, or I don't think I really agree with what I said, and I'm running off the cuff unscripted, so it's likely that I forget something or get something wrong that could affect the ranking. So keep all of that in mind. You know, the normal caveats apply. So I'm going to go in the ranking order, not in chronological order. So this is not by release date of the game, but by the ranking that you all had it in as the fans. Now, these rankings were not done in a like a ranked choice voting way. This was normalized out of 10. So people could have voted 1 out of 10 for everything, could have voted 10 out of 10 for everything. So this is based off of average rating. If you've not seen the fan ranking videos, go check them out. This is the top 10 of those playing in the bottom right corner that you can see right now. So the lowest rated game, and and by the way, I'm not doing the spin-off games here. No Tokyo Mirage Sessions, no Warriors, no Heroes. They weren't on this list. I don't really want to, you know, rank heroes or anything anyway, because that creates its own whole mess of a discussion that's sort of separate from the game itself. So Revelations was voted the worst game in the series. That does not surprise me at all, just because of the reputation of the game. And part of me thinks that the reason that Revelation scored the worst is that a lot of people who never played it gave it a 1. And I know people don't rate things the same way I do. I generally do not give 1 out of 10s. I wouldn't give 10 out of 10s. I think those are very, very, very difficult ratings to get that usually come from knee-jerk reactions. I'm not saying anybody is wrong for thinking Revelation is a 1 out of 10, but that for me, I immediately get suspicious when I see 1 be the dominant rating, and then everything else being more normally distributed on a bell curve. Same thing for Tokyo Mirage Sessions. But yeah, Revelation, does it suck? I mean, yeah, it does, but not in a way that's particularly unique amongst the, I guess you'd say, Fates Trio or Fates Trilogy, because the maps, the most famous part of the game, are terrible, but a lot of the bad maps are not uniquely bad as far as Fates is concerned. It's just that some of the really bad ones, the snow map being the most infamous, are just kind of tedious, or ones like the ice boat can be very unintuitive, the way you read the terrain and how you're supposed to move on it. You know, those are maps that I had a lot of issues with the first time, either from boredom or just not really understanding what I was even looking at. The story also is not uniquely bad. It suffers from a lot of the same problems as Birthright and Conquest. Although I'd say of the 3, and I'll get into this later, Conquest is probably the best story of all of them. Revelation's story is just, I mean, it's fan service, and it's annoying, and it's too long. It is salvaged fairly generously by Fates' mechanics. Fates can get away with a lot of bad map design, a lot of bad story, by its gameplay being very good, or its gameplay systems being very good. The problem with Revelations is that, yeah, it's not built particularly well. You look at the early game cast, especially, you have characters like Gunter or Jacob or Korn that are very, very good. And then on the opposite end, you've got, Rinka or Hana, who do literally 0 damage or 1 damage on Lunatic. Like, it is as close to useless as you can feasibly get in Fire Emblem. It's as if half the cast is New Mystery Ubello. And that is very, very, very obnoxious, at least on Lunatic. I think the benefit of Revelation, the reason people would like it, is that it does give you the biggest playground experience. You can really eugenics up an entire child army that's crazy, and you can build all kinds of crazy characters with crazy skill sets. If you view it as a sandbox character building RPG, you will probably very much like it, or at least like it in theory. But, bad story. I don't like to play the games that way, and of course, as with all things, this is my personal ranking. I don't think that Revelation really does a good job motivating you to play that way. I think you have to bring that play style into the game, and as somebody who didn't really super engage with that aspect, the game was just either boring or tedious or annoying, depending on where it was. I don't know if it's a D or F tier game. I mean, I think the systems are generally good enough that I can put it on D tier for now. Fire Emblem Gaiden, this was one of the games I talked about. I'm actually a little bit of a Gaiden stan. I think that it does have all the normal problems of the Famicom Duo, which is that it's very slow, it's very sluggish, it is hampered by time. But I think it's actually a massive improvement over the first Fire Emblem game. I think the fact that we don't have to do weapon or item management in this game is a gigantic boon. And it makes it a lot more playable than FE1, in my view. And it also just has a more involved, better story. The story of FE1 is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's very simple. It's quite nice. And I think it has, with Garneth and Medius, 2 pretty good villains. But Gaiden is definitely a step up. I think they learned a lot. The big problem with Gaiden, and what makes it kind of awful to play, despite all the positives, is that enemies are super bulky, they're super dodgy, you're super bulky and super dodgy. It's just individual battles can go on for a very, very, very long time with just your characters and the enemies smacking into each other, just hoping to get numbers and the RNG to work out to where eventually someone dies, hopefully the enemy. It can be very tedious to play. The high terrain bonuses, the big avoid that a lot of enemies have, is very frustrating. There's obviously ways to offset this, and this gets less bad as the game goes on. It gets, I think, a lot better as the game goes on, but you do have to get through, I think, a fairly brutal Act 1 and Act 2 before the game really starts to come into its own. And by brutal, I don't mean difficult, I just mean very, very tedious. So, good game, and I think if I played it back in 91, I would have absolutely been blown away by it. I think it is a lot better than its reputation precedes, but, held back, C tier. FE1 is another game I talked about. I like the story of this game, especially for an NES game that doesn't have a lot of super involved dialogue. I think it's a lot of fun in spurts. I've played through this game 3 times, which actually makes it, of all these games, the Fire Emblem game that I have cleared the most. Yet it's the game I seem to retain the least amount of knowledge from, because I don't know. I get into a zone where I don't absorb a ton of this game. It is a very flat game, and despite its great aesthetics, it's a very kind of boring game to play because of how slow it is, because of how much tedium there is involved in item management. That's the thing that everybody is going to go back to, is the item management in FE1 is absolutely miserable. Gaiden gets rid of consumable items. It gets rid of multiple weapon slots, so you really don't ever have to trade. But in this game, you don't even have trading. Truly a massive victim of its time, but one that I don't think we should give quarter to just because it is old, because it's clear by what Gaiden did that Shozukaga and his team at Intelligent Systems looked at a lot of FE1 and they knew, yeah, these systems do not work on this hardware very well. So we've got to fix a lot of this. So I think historical interest, yes. Actually to play it, not one of the better aged important Famicom games. I think there's a lot of Famicom and NES games that have aged significantly better, that if you want to go play, play those. I'd say for hardcore fans only. I get why all these are towards the bottom. I disagree with Gaiden. What I don't disagree with is Birthright. I actually think this game should be lower. I actually think it should be the bottom of the list. It has the worst problems of all three Fates games without a lot of the benefit. The general zeitgeist around the Fates trio is that Revelation is the worst, Conquest is the best gameplay, Birthright is the best story. I actually think that this is completely wrong. I think that Birthright has the worst gameplay, and I think it has the worst story. Because I don't think Conquest's story does Corrin any favors as far as making Corrin interesting, but at least in principle, I can see what you're trying to go for. What happens when you have an army that has a leader that really is not prepared to do the things necessary to win. Now, usually what happens is that you lose and you don't get away with it, but, Fire Emblem's not going to let that happen. But Corrin's character does at least have some interesting conflict going on in Conquest. There's a disconnect between what Corrin does and what Corrin needs to do that I think has the vaguest, smallest, most minuscule amount of interest that you can possibly have. Birthright just kind of lets Corrin coast. It's an obnoxious story that goes on for way too long, very generic, very basic, very, very bloated. I know that a lot of people said closer to the game's release, I don't know how much of a common opinion this is now, that Fates would be better if it had its original uncut script, that a lot of Fates was cut out. And it is possible that would be the case. I highly doubt it, though, because Birthright especially is already incredibly bloated, a very thick game with a lot of boring flat maps where you just kind of steamroll hordes of enemies, where you can kind of go on autopilot a little bit. I did a Iron Man of this game with Speedy Hawk on his channel, and yeah, we didn't beat the game without game overs. We did game over a couple of times, but we were pretty much able to beat it by the end, just pairing up Corrin and smashing Intern on Lunatic. Just not that good of a game, a fairly brain dead one with not a lot of story to really cover for it. I think it's the worst game in the series. I'm not a fan. Maybe you are. Maybe there's something I'm missing about this game, so let me know if there's something I'm not thinking about with Birthright. So next is Mystery of the Emblem. Mystery of the Emblem, kind of weird to see it this low, although not surprising. From what I understand in Japan, this game is still incredibly popular, one of the best-selling Fire Emblem games, and one that people have a lot of nostalgia for over there. We don't have that nostalgia over here. The game never came out outside of Japan. To this day, it has never been released outside of Japan. And you know what? I think there's a lot going for this game. I think it's rated a little too low on this fan list. I actually think that it is better than its remake, New Mystery of the Emblem. Although, I should say there are two parts of Mystery of the Emblem, which is Book 1, which is a remake of FE1, and there's Book 2, which is a sequel to FE1. The story of the sequel I actually think is very, very nice. I think Book 2 has a good story, and it's got some bad maps in it, but I think it does a lot of interesting things. This is the game that introduced trading properly. This is the game that introduced dismounting as a mechanic for mounted units. And it's a very simple change, but having to dismount on indoor maps completely changes the approach that you have to building your army. One of my favorite things about Mystery of the Emblem, and we'll see this later with Thracia 776, is that character utility really changes a lot by map. In most Fire Emblem games, you have, okay, you got a dancer, you've got a healer, you got maybe a secondary staff user, and then a bunch of combat units that you're going to pour in, and very rarely do you have to change that up. Maybe there's a desert map where you want to bring more mages or bring some thieves, or your thieves are like utility that are going to use on certain maps. Mystery of the Emblem really changes that up. You've got basically multiple different groups of combat units that you want to bring depending on the map, depending on if it's indoor or if it's outdoor, if you're going to go indoors. Actually, you know what? On Mystery of the Emblem, I don't know if there's any maps like Thracia where it's split between indoor and outdoor. I think they're all one or the other. I could be misremembering, could be forgetting a couple. But there's like, you know, a lot of different loadouts that you need to work with depending on the situation. And I actually really, really like that. I like having to rotate through my characters. I like having to use a bunch of different characters. I like combat units having more qualities about them besides combat that contextually make them better or worse depending on the situation. And as a whole, I think this is a very, very nice game. Of the first, 3 games, this is by far the best. The thing holding it back is that Book 1 kind of sucks. Even though it plays more smoothly than FE1, a lot of the maps are directly translated. And FE1 was not designed with dismounting in mind, so some of the indoor maps in Book 1 can become really GBA tier slogs. Maybe even worse, because the game just runs more slowly. And that kind of sucks. I think Book 1 really holds it back. When most people talk about FE3, they're really only talking about Book 2, but the game's both parts. I think Book 2 might be like kind of up here, A, B tier, roundabout. It's got some terrible maps, Chapter 3, the most infamous of which. But it's got a nice story. Book 1, maybe C or D tier. I'll drop it in B tier. I like me some Mystery of the Emblem. Then we got Binding Blade. If you want to talk about... this is probably going to be the most contentious opinion that I have. I mean, I've been over this before. Anyone who watches my streams or seen some of my other videos and seen me talk about it, I think Binding Blade is pretty terrible. I'm not a fan. A lot of people are. And this is probably the thing I get criticized the most over. Usually when I've seen people, talk about me, whether it's directly to me or about me, which one of the weird things about being someone on the internet is that sometimes people will just talk about you. And this is where people deride me by far the most, is on Binding Blade. So here's the challenge here. I'm going to talk about Binding Blade. I'm not going to talk about hit rates. We're not going to talk about hit rates because everyone talks about it. No one's ever going to see eye to eye on this issue. Instead, my problem with the Binding Blade, having replayed it recently, is 2 major critical issues. One is kind of an issue across all 3 GBA games. And then the other is an issue with the game's story. This is by far the worst story in Fire Emblem, I'd say, from about Mystery of the Emblem up through Fates. I'd say Fates is quite a bit worse. The Binding Blade story is not bad in like this traditional internet way we think about it. We very much think about the internet in terms of like this kind of Mr. Plinkett, Cinema Sins, plot hole kind of driven thing. The story of FE6 is like, yeah, okay, it's solid. You've got things that make sense and things happen in ways that are logical, sure. But Elebe as a continent is incredibly boring. That needed a Blazing Sword to really kind of give it more depth. Roy is not the correct main character for this story. This game, more than any other in the series, definitely suffers from "it was actually a dragon all along" syndrome, perhaps worse than any other game. And so you end up with a main villain that's ultimately fairly inconsequential, replaced by a bigger villain in Jan, who's ultimately inconsequential. And Roy doesn't really have a strong relationship to either of these characters. It's not like Leon and Sacred Stones, where, Erica and Ephraim are very, very involved with him throughout their lives. I actually think that if you wanted to retell the Binding Blade story to be good, I think Fa should be the main character. Because then you have an area that both is attacked and attempted to be destroyed by Zephiel. So you have that Zephiel relationship there. and also a direct connection to the dragons and what it means to be born a dragon and what it means to be born in a conflict that's basically entirely artificial, where two sides are just killing each other for no reason. I think that would be a much more fascinating game. Instead, we're left with Roy and Merlinus, who are not really interesting as leads for the story that is being told here. The other problem, and then this is the Game Boy problem, is that the GBA games, for the most part, do a very, very bad job of motivating you to get better at playing. These are games that really heavily reward turtling. They really reward playing slow. They really reward becoming a big ball of death. They really reward grinding at the arena, support grinding at the end of chapters. And so it's very easy to snowball these games in the most tedious and boring way possible. What I have found is that people who love Binding Blade tend to play Binding Blade with certain personal conditions. They're not going to support grind. They're going to play fast, whether that's LTC or just trying to be as efficient as possible. They're going to really get a move on. But that's a play style you bring into the game. Binding Blade itself, and to a lesser degree Blazing Sword and Sacred Stones, do not actually reward that play style. In fact, it's not only that they don't reward that play style, it's that they overly reward just balling up all of your characters and just moving them as one big block across the map, as slow as possible, as carefully as possible. If you want to see a good example, actually, of this not being done within Binding Blade, you can look at Chapter 11A. Chapter 11A is a nearly perfect chapter, and maybe the best chapter in the GBA series, because it really, really, really rewards you for playing fast, for figuring out ways to get a move on with all those villages and all the rewards that are up in the air, that are on the table for you to get if you play fast. That map, I say, is near perfect. The Klein and Tate recruitments are really bad because of the chance that they don't move. Anyone who saw my recent Iron Man of the game knows that, yeah, I'm not a fan of that part of it. The other issue is that if you're a new player and you're playing the game for the first time, the vast majority of people do play these games for the first time, and then that's it. These are long games that require a lot of investment to play multiple times. There's a lot of chapters in this game that are just super tedious and really annoying for new players because they're either aggressively mean, like Chapter 14, or they're, again, just really slow and lethargic. Chapter 8, 8X, 16, 24, maybe Chapter 24 may be one of the worst maps in the entire franchise, along with the conversation between Roy and Jan being one of the worst in the series. This is overall a game that I think is partially a victim of its time, an incomplete engine for GBA that has not been fully maximized yet, and just not giving me any motivation to either care deeply about the story. You know, I will say the true ending cutscene with Fa and Idun is one of the best cutscenes in the series. Idun gets hit on the head with the coconut, you get your SpongeBob memes in, and then Fa laughs and runs circles around Idun on the screen. It's adorable, and it's one of the best things in the franchise, one of the best little character moments, but we just do not get moments like that throughout Binding Blade, in the dialogue or in the way the game is animated. Really weak entry for me. It's better than Birthright, though. Sacred Stones is also... Not Sacred Stones. Shadow Dragon. This is the one review that was not positive in the fan ranking because Linking hates this game, but he didn't tell me that. And he was like, oh, man, yeah, Shadow Dragon is so fantastic. He was playing the long con, and he pulled me... He got me on it. I think Shadow Dragon is pretty bad, and I think it's interesting that Shadow Dragon and its sequel, New Mystery of the Emblem, are right next to each other, because I do think these two games are pretty far apart in terms of quality. When we get to New Mystery, I'm going to say that it's a lot better than Shadow Dragon. So Shadow Dragon gets a lot of points from people for being well written, but I think a lot of it is that it's well written because it's not very written. There's not a lot of dialogue, not a lot of cutscenes here. It gets the job done. It's very utilitarian writing. Sometimes you do get nice little character moments. Marth gets a couple of sassy lines in there. But for the most part, does it make the game well written? I mean, it gets the job done. Again, story, it serves a utility. It's not horrendous by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also not that much more interesting. It doesn't have that much more depth than the original game. Shadow Dragon is a remake of FE1 and just doesn't add a whole lot to the story of that game for me to give it a ton of points. It really is coasting off of the original. Obviously, the art style is just generally pretty desaturated, pretty bland. Characters don't do a whole lot to stand out, to be unique either from story or from gameplay. Those are pretty pedestrian concerns, though. My big problem with Shadow Dragon is that it has the almost exact opposite problem of Binding Blade. Binding Blade rewards you for playing slow, for turtling up and just big ball of deathing the map. Shadow Dragon is almost the exact opposite. The second half of the game, whether you're on normal mode, hard 3 or hard 5, really rewards you to play fast, really rewards you to one-turn maps, to warp skip maps. You get so many warp staffs, you get the Hamern staff, you get a lot of tools. The problem is that the one turns in Sacred Stones, or in Shadow Dragon, the 1 and 2 turn clears that are very motivated because you don't have to actually really engage with the map are super easy to pull off. It's not like Three Houses where you really are solving a puzzle and piecing together a strategy, a very complex strategy to get one turns by. You really do it very easily. Clearing hard 5 Shadow Dragon from about chapter 12 or 13 onwards, basically once you get done with the pirate map on the Dragon Island, once you get done with that, hard 5 Shadow Dragon becomes one of the most mindless games in the series for me, where nothing is memorable. I'd never go for chests, never go for anything. I just warp skip everything, and it's pretty free, because forging and promotion gains and effective damage are all just so broken, and the warp staff is so broken that the easiest way to play the game is the way that is the most rewarded, which, I don't think that makes it a very good strategy game. So I'm going to drop this bad boy here, and I'll put it over Revelation. I'll put it slightly under FE1, although as far as playability is concerned, definitely above this. Also, now that that's done, let's resize this screen here a little bit. This tier list. Oh, yeah. Now we're talking. Let them block a little bit there of the bottom. Okay, so New Mystery of the Emblem from a gameplay perspective is significantly better. For one, its hardest difficulty, Lunatic. Now, I've never played Lunatic Reverse. I've never beaten Lunatic. I'm simply not smart enough to do it. I do think it has some very, very significant problems, mostly in how it's tutorialized. I think Lunatic requires you to know some things that are completely unreasonable to know about the game's internal system, such as how to determine enemy movement order. I think the game does an okay job of tutorializing enemy attack priority, how they prioritize damage. I think there's some things in it that are still too esoteric with how the game tutorializes it, the way it factors in critical hits, the way it'll sometimes factor in hit and avoid, as far as I've been able to tell. Very out there stuff, but the big one that I think is a problem is enemy movement order. There's simply no mechanical way internally to figure out how the enemies choose to move. I don't know how you would ever know to cycle through enemies using the left or right buttons without having looked it up. So that's a problem. That's kind of a minor problem. I think if you're someone seriously playing Lunatic, you're probably crazy enough and in the know enough to where you're looking it up. I don't think that gives the game points. But the other thing is that Lunatic enemies, not super dodgy, not super tanky. Early game hard 5 Shadow Dragon is one of the hardest sections in the series, and a lot of it's for kind of bullshit reasons, because the bosses of those first 3 maps in Shadow Dragon are horrendous on hard 5. Maybe the 3 worst bosses in the entire series. New Mystery never really has that problem. New mystery maps. You don't get a whole lot of warp staff uses. You don't get it at all on Lunatic, which I think is its own separate discussion. I don't think it's a good design to take away tools on the hardest difficulty, especially because the warp staff is not nearly as broken because there's only one of it. I can see what they were thinking, but that's up in the air. That's up to your personal philosophy, I suppose. I don't mind hard modes that change things, but taking tools away is a little weird. The biggest problem with New Mystery is that its story is fairly awful compared to Mystery of the Emblem Mystery of the Emblem Book 2. Because the main story is good, but there's so much time in this game dedicated to this assassin's plotline where our new avatar character, Chris, the first truly customizable avatar in the series, takes center stage, mostly away from Marth. I'd say he shares center stage, shares protagonist role, fairly equal with Marth. And yeah, he's not that good of a character. He's a great unit, but he's a terrible character, says a lot of very weird things, uncomfortable things, looks at Ryan in one of the supports and says, I wish I had a docile little brother like you. Gets really handsy and feely with Sheena. That's a weird scene. Belf has to teach him how to open a door. Just a bizarre character. And a lot of the supports, it's hard to say because we are using a fan translation here. Pala says, I'm sorry for cramping your style, which has big Jurassic World Dominion slid into my DM's energy. It just does not sound right. Obviously, it's hard to judge specific translation lines like that, but it's what we have to go off of because I can't read Japanese, so I can't tell you if that is exactly how they wrote it or not, or how they meant it. I feel like with supports, one of the big criticisms of Shadow Dragon is that there was no supports to make characters feel different, and as with all things, the monkey paws curled, and we have the supports of New Mystery. So, gameplay, pretty solid game. Only a handful of truly awful maps. Some of the Gaiden maps are bad. Chapter 3 is terrible. But, pretty decent game. I'd say the story points make it worse than Mystery of the Emblem, but I'm gonna slap it right there on B tier. I didn't like New Mystery for a long time, but playing it a lot really kind of sold it on me. Fire Emblem Awakening, I've not read the story of this game in 10 years, just to be clear. This is like the story of the stories of all the games in here, this is the one I'm the least familiar with, which is kind of weird, because this was the entry point for a lot of people in the series. It wasn't my entry point, but it was the first game that came out when I was a fan of the series. Awakening goes from the most fun you can possibly have playing Fire Emblem to the most boring you can possibly have playing Fire Emblem. So Lunatic and Lunatic Plus are pretty notoriously bad difficulties. They're not super well thought out. Lunatic Plus especially is just some kind of joke. Feels a lot like Nightmare Mode in Doom, where it's just like, hey, look, we're just going to make a troll difficulty, and that is what it is. Lunatic, though, gives this game the reputation of being a massive stomp, where you take Robin or you take Chrom, and you just sort of snowball them out of control, and you annihilate the game. You Nosferatu tank the game. You just 1v400 every map. And even on hard mode, that kind of becomes the case. So the first act of the game, the first half of the game, you have some of the most fun Fire Emblem, I think, in the series. The big thing about Awakening is that it's the first game since Thracia to really change up the formula. Adding pair up was a pretty substantial thing because it changed a lot of the ways we can think about characters. It changes the way we move. It changes, we move completely differently now. We can use characters to boost stats. It gives all kinds of new utility, all kinds of new movement tech that's very interesting on top of the standard Fire Emblem formula. And the early part of Awakening really pushes you to enjoy a lot of that. You've got like the Chapter 5 is a great map. I really like it. Trying to save Rickon and Maribel it's pretty trivial for me now, but early on playing the game, it really taught me to like, okay, focus on movement here. How are we going to get, Lissa into rescue range if you have the rescue staff? Or how are we going to get Frederick up there fast enough? What are ways we can boost our movement here? What are ways we can make characters tankier to make them survive this onslaught, or to draw heat off of Rick and Maribel while you try to get them to safety? Really, the first half of the game is very, very solid, at least on hard mode. Chapter 2 on Lunatic kind of sucks, but for the most part, very solid first half of the game. But then the enemies all promote. The story kind of stops being good and just takes a break. It just decides I'm on strike now. You're just gonna go fight 300 hordes, hordes of 300 enemies on single maps. They overpower the vast majority of your cast. Everybody dies, and then it becomes a Juggernaut solo where you take Robin or some hyper trained character. In my Iron Man, it was Donald, and you just brutalize the game. With that, you mash in turn, you skip enemy phase. Becomes tedious almost in the opposite way of the NES games. The NES games are tedious because they're slow. Awakening becomes tedious because it's brain dead by the end, pretty much no matter the difficulty. Lunatic Plus notwithstanding, of course, because, that one's a joke. But, I mean, not the worst. People accuse the characters of this game of being pretty gimmicky. I think as a whole, they're better than Fates' characters. I think the issue is that characters come off gimmicky in the story. This could be wrong, so somebody correct me. The characters in Awakening are kind of gimmicky in the story, but in the supports, they have a pretty good amount of depth. The whole nobody sees Kellum or Gaius only wants to talk about candy is pretty much a thing only when they interact with the main story. Does that suck? Yeah, it kind of sucks that they only get kind of jokes in the story, but the supports are there and it's quite nice. And I think the story does a good job of integrating the kids into it, integrating a second phase. I think it's cool. I think Awakening is pretty fun. I'm gonna put it, I think it's my favorite of all of them so far. We're in the top 10, by the way. Blazing Sword. Okay, I'm so dog shit at Blazing Sword. I do think Hector Hard Mode does a much better job than Binding Blade of motivating fast play, mostly because it just stuck flyers everywhere, which, hey, you know what? It's a blunt tool. It kind of works. It means you've got to be a lot more proactive where you are going to get overrun, at least in the early game of Hector Hard Mode. So I'd say, or you have defense maps like Battle Before Dawn that force you to move towards the defense point because you start very far away. So you've got to get in there to get stuff done. So I'd say Blazing Sword is a fairly big improvement over Binding Blade. Its story, I think, is a lot more fun. The story of Blazing Sword's not that good if you're going for depth and meaning and heart-wrenching, narrative. But if you just want, Saturday morning cartoon, matinee cinema, having a fun story, I think Blazing Sword tells a pretty fun story. It's a nice one. Not super deep. Not everything has to be, though. All I ask is that you be engaging. I think the story's decently engaging, decently fun. A lot of goofy shit, but hey, goofy shit is fun. I don't know where I rank it, though, because I'd probably put it in B tier. Maybe. B. I don't have a lot to say about it, but I like it. Probably like it less than Awakening. Probably, I'll put it right there. Yeah. Genealogy of the Holy War is the contentious one. You love it or hate it. Everybody knows this game is contentious. It depends on whether or not, and this might sound incendiary, but if you're a trained seal that claps your hands when things make deep lore sense, like the world map lining up to the in-game gameplay maps, hey, look, this is the game for you. I think that this is a game that has a significantly more positive reputation than it probably otherwise would because it was never released outside of Japan, so it has a mystique to it. And its massive, epic sprawl is visually and aesthetically very impressive. To actually sit down and play it, though, without the modern conveniences of speed up, pretty tedious game. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. There are certain chapters of this game that are brilliant. The prologue is brilliant. Chapter 7 is brilliant. I love Chapter 7. I love the final chapter of Part 1, actually. The major problem with Genealogy is that, one, you can save every turn, so it feels like for a massive sweeping game, it feels fairly inconsequential. I think better paced out checkpoints would have been better. I think being able to save at castles instead of at any time would have been an improvement. You know, maybe you could make suspend that. I don't know if that'd be possible on Super Nintendo TAC, but yeah, I'm not sure there, but I think that would have been an improvement. And then this is a game with a very sweeping epic story that is undone a little bit by the fact that, yeah, everything's a seas map. Everything kind of moves in the same direction as one another. Every chapter plays very similarly. Sometimes you do get these great little story moments, like the desert in chapter 5, when, I'm not going to spoil the story, but it's when a certain spear horse bro comes back and gets obliterated in the desert. That's a very interesting moment where they're using the large terrain of a map to really help tell the story. I think for the most part, everything being seas, I think this is a game that would benefit a lot from diversified map objectives. It needs defend maps. It needs survive maps. It needs escape maps. We'll see that with its sequel, Thracia 776, that this was probably a thought in intelligent systems as well. The main character of the first part of the game, Sigurd, is a very interesting character. A lot of people don't like him because he's kind of a shit dad, but you know what? It's a character trait. You know what? I'll take it. I think Sigurd is a fascinating main character for a game like this because kind of like he's almost like a better Corrin in a weird way, because he's the wrong person in the right situation, if that makes sense. This is a moment ready-made for a hero, for a fantasy hero, and Sigurd is just not the person. He always acts slightly wrong. Sometimes he's too reserved. Sometimes he's too aggressive. Sometimes he tries to show up and prove his worth. Other times he tries to be laid back, but it seems like his actual ability to detect if the situation calls for that behavior is completely off. He almost always gets it wrong, and it is a fascinating main character that I think is really interesting and could really be elevated by better map design, by less tedious map design, and by fixing the way the arena in this game works. The arena in this game is pretty necessary to grind up a lot of the characters to get them to be functional. You don't need the arena to beat the game. People have beaten it without it, but it's pretty inadvisable to do so because for a new player, it is your primary way of both getting levels and getting money. So to avoid the arena completely takes a lot of meta knowledge of the game to know where you can get money consistently and how to give it to different characters, and really you have to plan everything out. I think a lot more than is reasonable on a first playthrough. So Genealogy is a game I respect a lot of the ideas of. I don't think any of it works that well. So, like, A tier for ambition, D tier for product. Fate's Conquest, I mean, you're talking great gameplay and you're talking terrible story. I don't know how much. I mean, the fact that this appears on the list a lot higher than the rest of the Fates games does not surprise me, not even for a second. Very tedious story, though. Awful story. But it is the one story that does kind of play into Corrin a little bit better, I think, as a character. Now, ultimately, the story does not, I think, really embrace investigating Corrin in an interesting way. I think it sort of lets a lot of his problems slide without any serious investigation. But I do think Corrin's problems are interesting because he is very similar to Sigurd in that, yeah, he is not the person who needs to be in charge of this situation, but he is. And Genealogy really does explore how that affects an army and what the fate of an army with that kind of leader is like. Conquest really doesn't. It's kind of disappointing. But to actually play Conquest, holy shit, that's a fun time. That's a good ass time. I mean, I don't know where I'd put it up here. I mean, there's some terrible maps, but like, what Fire Emblem game can you not say that about? Probably put it above Gaiden. I think the story really brings it down a lot. I don't think it brings it down as much as these two games get brought down, but if this is like a gameplay tier list, yeah, I'll put like Conquest A tier. But this is like a trying to combine all reasons, I guess. So Conquest and C. All right, Sacred Stones. I mean, now we're getting into the top 6. We're getting into some pretty good shit, I think, at this point. The top of this tier list looks pretty barren because we're going in fan ranking order from lowest to highest. And I generally have agreed for the most part. Well, no, I disagree a lot on some of these, but Sacred Stones, I mean, this game's nice. This game's real nice. Has the same GBA problem where you're not really pushed to play the game all that well. But I'm a hypocrite, and I think this game's story really elevates it above all the rest, because what we have essentially is a Blazing Sword tier story on its face that has a surprising amount of depth compared to a lot of the other games in the series, and especially compared to the other two GBA games. So this game is especially focused on like the way people change and the way memory influences the way we understand people. So there's a decision made late in this game by its main character, Erica, that causes everybody to be like, Erica is such an idiot and dumb and has poo-poo butt brain and makes me want to barf and shit my pants. But that decision is actually fascinating because thematically, what it reveals about the actual struggle of doing the logical smart thing in a situation. We all can act high and mighty like, oh, I would do the smart thing. But when you love a person and you've been with a person and you've grown up with them, or you've lived your life with them, and then you see the way that they change, actually accepting that and then doing the steps to accept it, which in this case would be refusing Leon's request towards the end of the game, is very, very difficult. We see that in Orson. Orson's unable to accept his wife's death. Seth is unable to accept, his changing role in the army, although his is a little different. I do think Seth is a very interesting character about the way as well that we will place extreme value in our ordained roles. And there's a lot in this game about trying to break away from predetermined structure, the structures of monarchy, the structures of servitude, the structures of knighthood. Very fascinating story. A lot of people criticize this game for being very easy, and as a whole, it is. I think for new players, it's plenty challenging, but for series experts, for veterans, it is very easy. It does have infinite grinding. It does let you get away with a lot of turtling. It still has the GBA support system that is terrible and awful and rewards grinding and infinite patience. But I fucking love this game. S tier. There you go. Duality of man. I said basically the same thing about Binding Blade and Sacred Stones, but I love the story of Sacred Stones so much. You want to talk about really good game too? Thracia 776. One of the few games in the series where difficulty is not determined so much by combat and stats and the difficulty of the enemies, but by how much bullshit the game can throw at you. Like, it just keeps piling it on. So Thracia is probably the least played game in the series at this point, I'd say, with the exception of the Famicom games, or at least Gaiden, since FE1 did get a North American release. I'd say that of the Japanese exclusive games, Thracia is one of the least played, making it one of the least played in the series. But it has a big cult following, and for good reason. Unlike Genealogy, it is significantly more successful at telling its story through gameplay. Leaf, as a lord, is on the run. He's just going through he's just having a bad time, and you're having a bad time with him. From the Manster arc up until all those horrifying Loptian mages throwing berserk staffs, throwing sleep staff, silence, entrapping you, rewarping themselves to come kick your fucking ass all over the place. You've got enemies showing up 10 leadership stars, getting You're getting wrapped back around to the beginning of maps. Objectives are changing. Leaf will fuck up and just nearly get half of his army murdered, and you have no control over it. It is a fascinating game. One of the best in the series. Really makes you feel like a scrappy army. Really makes you feel like your back is against the wall. Sometimes maps do get a little excessive, but most of the time, especially in the Little Manster patch, you do get a good sense of what to prepare for. You might not know the specifics, but you have just enough intelligence to where you're not flying completely blind in the dark and will get 100% screwed over. But, you know, sometimes you will just still get fucked up. And it does kind of suck when it happens. And it can get very demotivating. Me and Speedy Hawk attempted to do a Iron Man of this on his channel, and it just didn't work out. Sometimes this game can just not work out, depending on how certain things go. But overall, I dig it. A tier. And we're looking at Three Houses here. So Three Houses is, god damn. I mean, the discourse of this game is run dry. I don't know what I can add that anybody else has said. I feel like all my thoughts on this game are very generic, very stable, very normal. Normal things you hear about this game. Monastery sucks. And is tedious. And being able to turn any character into anything has a lot of cool meme potential. But it often just ends up being tedious. I mean, what do you want me to say about Three Houses? You have thoughts on this game. I have thoughts on this game. And those thoughts are almost the exact same. The tedium really kills it, though. It significantly kills it. I think this is a game that would have benefited much more from a structure similar to Radiant Dawn, where you play with all of the characters in the game and then you have to make a serious decision mid-game. As I think it's actually... one of the interesting things is that, you know, you can replay Genealogy of the Holy War 10 times. The maps are always going to be the same. They're always going to be the same maps. Nobody ever complains about that. They might complain about individual maps, but nobody complains about the fact that the maps are always the same. Three Houses people do, because the game basically has almost 50 hours of setup in its first half with a lot of tedious monastery stuff. And then the route split actually happens, but because you make your decision for the route split at the beginning of the game, it basically means that nothing interesting can happen in the first half of the game that could challenge or question who you side with or agree with in the story. And that, I think, is the big missed opportunity. The decision to lead each house should be made in the middle of the game, and by it not being that way, I think this game loses a lot of its narrative steam, a lot of its interesting route choice steam. But still lots of... I still think it's generally pretty fun. And honestly, if I'm just going by how much I play it, I probably play it more than all these. I think it has enough problems to not be up here, but I think it's generally very fun enough to where it slots in there pretty easily. All right, then we got Fire Emblem Echoes. I did not like this game when it came out. I've played it again. I love it now. I think this is one of the best games in the series. I think it's brilliant. I think a lot of the things that people have problems with are the maps and the avoid tiles. The avoid tiles suck. But I think there's only a couple maps in this game that are actually pretty bad. I think Nui Baba's Abode is bad. I think that the barricade map with all the mire sorcerers is bad. And I think some of the swamp maps are bad, but for the most part, most of the maps in this game I think are really, really, really good. And I think the game gives you enough tools to deal with it. And if you don't play this game with the turn wheel, it is really intense and interesting and requires you to really buckle down and use all your tools. And I think playing with turn wheel doesn't even change it all that much from that point. I do think turn wheel, sometimes people look at turn wheel and they'll say, this game introduced turn wheel precisely because it's a bullshit game. When I think turn wheel was just a quality of life feature responding to the fact that no matter what they did, people kept resetting to go for perfect runs. And so Intelligent Systems was like, okay, if people are going to insist to play like this, then let's at least make it a little more convenient for them. Fair enough. I don't think it had a particularly negative effect on the gameplay design, because I actually think that between supports and weapon forging and an economy that you have to actually manage, Echoes gives you a ton of tools and a ton of interesting tools that are varied. It is so fun. And then the story and the presentation, of course, the presentation is the best presentation in the entire franchise. Maybe some of the best RPG presentation, period. Truly great. It's a beautiful game. It has the best music in the series. I haven't talked about music at all in these rankings. I'm not huge on a lot of Fire Emblem music, but Echo's score is brilliant. It is so good. Everything from the title theme onward is great in Echoes. I think the only flaw this game has, other than like the handful of bad maps, is that there is a spoiler moment late in the game that's revealed about Alm, the game's protagonist, that I do think undercuts a pretty big portion of the game's thematic drive. I don't think it ruins it completely, because this game is primarily about, a rebellion against a king and against a tyrannical king, and the fact that monarchy basically has no legitimacy, but it's kind of undercut by the end a little bit. Not to where the story changes, but to where it doesn't feel as strong, where it doesn't feel as moving. But I think the vast majority of this game is still really, really good. I'm putting it right here in S tier. Radiant Dawn. Look, okay, part 4 on this channel is kind of a meme, because I'm like the guy who hates part 4 of Radiant Dawn because the maps are like gargantuan slogs and the story sells itself out. But I still love this game a lot. I love and adore Radiant Dawn. I love its structure. It is one of the few games in the series that really feels like a tactics game, because a lot of the RPG elements are sort of stripped out. There's not a whole lot of character growing that you can do because of the way this game is structured. You're jumping around between army to army. A lot of maps are pretty predetermined on who you'll have available to you until part 4, and I think that's part of why part 4 becomes a mess, because parts 1, 2, and 3 are very tightly wound from both story and gameplay perspective, but that's still the majority of the game. And it's not like part 4 and Endgame are terrible. They're still a lot of fun, I think. I think they're not as good, but I think they're still fun. And I think the first 3 parts might be the best designed gameplay in the Fire Emblem series. With the exception of Biorhythm. Biorhythm's pretty terrible, and hard mode is a pretty terrible hard mode because it just removes quality of life features. And by that, I mean enemy ranges, which is ridiculous and stupid and dumb. But Radiant Dawn, pretty good. And as far as the sequel goes, I love that it changes our perspective from the previous game. We were the obvious good guys in the first game in Path of Radiance, and now, is that as obvious? I mean, maybe. I think that playing as Crimea in Path of Radiance, we still did the correct thing, but the leadership of the army that we led kind of fucked up big time with how it handled Dain, and we see it from the Dain perspective. And I think that's pretty awesome. I think that's really cool. I like Radiant Dawn. Banger ass game. Putting it right here below Thracia. Now we got Path of Radiance. Okay, so Path of Radiance is like the pure Fire Emblem experience, because it gives you rewards for playing fast in the form of bonus experience, which is a great mechanic, because it lets you indulge. It takes your RPG tendency of wanting to hoard and indulge and get all the resources. But to get all the resources in the game, you can't turtle. You've got to play fast. You've got to be aggressive. You've got to get out there and get shit done. Brilliant, simple decision. What a great mechanic. The scene where Grail encounters the Black Knight and then Ike is holding him afterwards, and he accepts it. He accepts that his dad's dead at this point, or dying. And he just asks him for one moment more. That's it. Like, that's the peak of the franchise in terms of story moments, in terms of character moments, is that moment right there. And Path of Radiance really, I think, sustains that all the way through, because with that great heartbreaking character moment from pretty early in the game, you're in, man. You are into that story, and there ain't nothing that's going to stop you from getting fully invested, I don't think. Unless you just don't like the story. I guess that would stop you. But great hook, great, simple fantasy narrative that just does all the... It doesn't do anything fascinating or original in like a deep thematic sense, but it does all the basics, takes all the basics, does them all right, and there's great value in that. Absolutely love Path of Radiance. Has some bad maps towards the end. Clash is pretty bad, and its final boss, Ashnard, is one of the worst final bosses in the series. I think bosses in Fire Emblem, I've talked about this before, very hard thing to do correct, because it's like with all enemies, fighting a boss is just checking the numbers and then seeing who does the best and then figuring out how you can win. But the actual challenge in Fire Emblem is not doing that so much as it is managing your actions. You know, it's how can I maximize my actions here to keep people safe while also getting things done while I deal with multiple enemies coming at me at the same time. Bosses are like one enemy that usually sits still, and you just figure out how the numbers work out, and then that's pretty much it. It's very simple, and it's not super engaging. Ashnard is that, which is kind of a problem, because most of the final bosses, whether it's Veld or Idun, tend to be set pieces. They tend to be epic story moments, which I think works perfectly fine. It means you can't be soft locked. It means you can still get it done, but it means you still get like an epic scene. Ashnard can fuck your shit up even on hard mode, not just maniac mode, but on hard mode, and it can be unnecessarily difficult to deal with. I fucking hate Ashnard as a final boss, but beyond a couple of blemishes like that, or Clash, which is a terrible map, yeah, brilliant game. Putting it in A tier above Thracia. All right, so there you go. I don't like this ranking a whole lot because it's not super symmetrical. And you know me, I like symmetry. I like things going towards the mean, not the meme. Maybe if I dropped New Mystery down and then did this, now we're talking. Oh yeah. That's a good looking list. Look at that. Look at that perfect arc right there. That perfect bell curve. All right, well, agree, disagree, let me know. Let me know where my reasoning is wrong. Like I said, doing these off the cuff, doing this unscripted is difficult because I can, forget things or get things wrong or just say shit that doesn't make sense and I don't have time to think about it. As well, lists are kind of arbitrary. These tiering, these I can put, it's all arbitrary. It's all just a way to talk about things. I could put this in a list, put this in tiers, give these unnecessarily specific grades. It doesn't matter. But thank you all for watching or having this on as background noise, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.